Kira Voss adjusted her backpack straps for the third time that morning as she walked through the crowded hallways of Jefferson High School, her dark eyes scanning methodically for the quickest route to her next class. The familiar weight of her textbooks pressed against her spine, a constant reminder of the academic excellence that had become both her shield and her burden. At 17, she had cultivated the kind of understated presence that allowed her to blend into crowds effortlessly, moving through the sea of teenagers like a shadow that no one quite noticed until it was too late. Her petite frame, standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall in her worn sneakers, made her appear delicate and fragile to those who didn't know better. The oversized sweater she wore hung loosely on her small shoulders, carefully chosen to hide the lean muscle that years of disciplined training had built beneath her seemingly vulnerable exterior. Her straight black hair, which she had inherited from her mother, along with her dark almond eyes, fell in a deliberate curtain around her face, often serving as both a shield from unwanted attention and a veil behind which she could observe the complex social dynamics of her peers without being observed in return. Born to Korean immigrant parents who had arrived in America with nothing but determination and dreams of a better life for their children, Kira had learned from an early age that keeping a low profile was often the safest strategy in a school where standing out could make you a target for those who found differences threatening rather than interesting. Her parents, Jin and May Voss, had worked multiple jobs to establish their small but successful restaurant in the heart of downtown, sacrificing their own comfort and sometimes their health to ensure that Kira and her younger brother could have opportunities they themselves had never been afforded. The hallways of Jefferson High were a maze of social hierarchies, as complex and unforgiving as any ancient court system. Lockers lined the walls like metal sentries, each one representing someone's small piece of territory in the adolescent kingdom. The floors were polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights above, creating an almost sterile environment that seemed designed to strip away individuality rather than nurture it. Bulletin boards displayed student achievements and upcoming events, but Kira rarely stopped to read them anymore. She had learned that drawing attention to herself, even positive attention, could have unintended consequences. What her classmates didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined as they watched her navigate the hallways with careful, measured steps, was that Kira had been training in Taekwondo since she was 8 years old. The discipline had been introduced to her not as a hobby or an after-school activity, but as a necessity. Her father, Jin Voss, had been a former national competitor in South Korea, representing his country in international tournaments before a knee injury ended his competitive career and redirected his life toward immigration and family. Jin had insisted that both his children learn to defend themselves, understanding better than most the challenges they would face as minorities in a society that didn't always welcome differences with open arms. But he had also taught them something equally important, perhaps even more crucial than any physical technique or mental strategy. Discipline, he would tell them during their evening training sessions in the family's converted garage, meant knowing when not to fight, just as much as knowing how to fight effectively when circumstances left no alternative. True strength, he would say in his accented English, his weathered hands demonstrating perfect form even years after his competitive retirement, is having the power to completely destroy your enemies but consciously choosing a better path. These words echoed in Kira's mind every single day as she navigated the treacherous social minefield of high school, serving as both a philosophical anchor and a practical guide for her daily interactions. The converted garage where they trained had become a sanctuary for the Voss family. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling beams, their leather surfaces worn smooth by years of dedicated practice, Wooden training dummies stood in perfect alignment, each one representing hundreds of hours of repetitive drills designed to build muscle memory that would react faster than conscious thought. Mirrors covered one entire wall, allowing practitioners to observe and correct their form with ruthless precision. The concrete floor bore the marks of countless training sessions, small chips and scratches that told the story of a family's dedication to excellence and preparedness. Jin had transformed what was originally meant to house cars into a traditional dojang, complete with Korean flags and calligraphy that reminded him of his homeland. The walls displayed his old tournament photographs and certificates, faded reminders of glory days that had passed, but wisdom that remained eternally relevant. Every piece of equipment had been carefully selected and maintained, from the focus mitts that helped develop accuracy and timing to the protective gear that allowed for safe sparring sessions. During these training sessions, which occurred every evening after homework was completed and restaurant duties were fulfilled, Jin would share stories from his competitive days. He spoke of matches where victory had gone to the fighter who remained calm under pressure rather than the one who possessed the most explosive techniques. He described tournaments where respect and sportsmanship had proven more valuable than any trophy or medal. These lessons weren't just about martial arts. They were about life, about character, about the kind of person Kira should strive to become. Her younger brother Marcus had embraced the training with enthusiasm, but lacked Kira's natural grace and intuitive understanding of the art's deeper philosophies. At 14, he was more interested in the impressive kicks and flashy techniques that drew attention at school demonstrations. Kira, however, had always gravitated toward the subtle aspects of martial arts, the mental discipline, the strategic thinking, the ability to read an opponent's intentions before they fully formed in their own mind. The trouble that would eventually test every lesson her father had taught her began 3 weeks ago on what had seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. Kira had been navigating through the crowded cafeteria, her lunch tray carefully balanced as she searched for an empty table where she could eat in peace while reviewing notes for her afternoon chemistry exam. The cafeteria itself was a study in controlled chaos, with hundreds of teenagers packed into a space that seemed designed to maximize noise and minimize comfort. The accident happened in slow motion, as these things often do. Blake Morrison, the self-appointed king of Jefferson High's rigid social hierarchy, had been holding court at his usual table near the center of the room, surrounded by his loyal subjects who laughed at his jokes, whether they were funny or not. He stood 6 feet tall with the kind of naturally athletic quarterback build that made teachers instinctively look the other way when he got too loud or too aggressive in class. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled with expensive products that his wealthy parents purchased without question, and his clothes carried the subtle but unmistakable markers of significant family money. Blake had been gesticulating wildly while telling some story designed to impress his audience when Kira attempted to pass behind his chair. The collision was minor, barely more than a brush of her shoulder against his back, but it was enough to cause him to spill a few drops of his energy drink on his designer shirt. In any reasonable world, it would have warranted nothing more than a quick apology and perhaps an offer to help clean up. But Blake Morrison did not live in a reasonable world. He lived in a world where he was the center of the universe, and any disruption to his comfort or dignity was an unforgivable offense. The immediate silence that fell over their section of the cafeteria should have been Kira's first warning that this would not be a simple misunderstanding quickly resolved. Blake turned slowly in his chair, his blue eyes narrowing as they focused on her like a predator identifying prey. His perfectly white teeth were revealed in what might have been mistaken for a smile by someone who didn't understand the particular cruelty that adolescents were capable of inflicting upon each other. "Watch where you're going, foreign girl," Blake had sneered that first day, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet tables around them. The words were loud enough for at least half the cafeteria to hear, delivered with the kind of casual racism that he had learned to disguise as mere rudeness. Kira had simply apologized in her quiet, dignified way and attempted to continue toward an empty table, but something in her composed response had clearly irritated him. Perhaps it was the way she didn't cower or beg for forgiveness like so many of his previous targets had done. Perhaps it was how she met his eyes for just a moment before turning away, showing neither fear nor defiance, but simply acknowledgement that she had heard him and chosen not to engage. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity she maintained, even while apologizing for an accident that had been as much his fault as hers. Whatever it was, Blake had decided in that moment that she needed to be put firmly in her place, and he was exactly the person to do it. What Blake Morrison represented was more than just individual cruelty. He was the embodiment of a system that rewarded aggression and punished difference. His father was a prominent local businessman who donated generously to the school's athletic programs, ensuring that his son's behavior would be viewed through a lens of understanding rather than accountability. His mother served on the school board, wielding influence that made teachers and administrators reluctant to take disciplinary action that might reflect poorly on their own careers. Blake had learned early that consequences were for other people, particularly those who lacked the social connections and financial resources to protect themselves. His main accomplice in the systematic campaign of harassment that followed was Tyler Hendricks, a lanky redhead whose cruel smile seemed permanently etched on his freckled face. Tyler was the kind of person who lived for moments when he could watch others suffer, feeding off pain and humiliation like an emotional parasite. He possessed a particular talent for technology-enabled cruelty, always ready with his smartphone to record fights, embarrassing moments, or social media content that could be used to destroy reputations with viral efficiency. His cackling laugh had become a soundtrack to misery for countless students who had found themselves in his crosshairs. Tyler's family situation was different from Blake's, but equally enabling. His parents were both busy professionals who had essentially abdicated their parental responsibilities in favor of career advancement, leaving Tyler to raise himself with unlimited internet access and minimal supervision. The result was a teenager who had learned to navigate the digital world with predatory skill, while remaining emotionally stunted in ways that made genuine human connection impossible. He viewed other people primarily as sources of entertainment, and their suffering was the most entertaining content of all. The third member of their toxic triangle was Jessica Palmer, a girl whose stunning natural beauty had become a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. Jessica possessed the kind of effortless attractiveness that opened doors and pardoned sins. But she had also developed a vicious tongue that could destroy reputations with a few well-placed words whispered in the right ears. She had perfected the art of social destruction, understanding intuitively how to identify a person's deepest insecurities and exploit them for maximum damage. Jessica's cruelty was perhaps the most sophisticated of the three because it operated largely through social manipulation rather than direct confrontation. She could ruin a person's standing in the school's complex hierarchy without ever raising her voice or making an obviously aggressive move. Her weapons were rumors, exclusion, and the kind of psychological warfare that left no visible bruises but could destroy a person's sense of self-worth with devastating efficiency. Together, Blake, Tyler, and Jessica formed what could only be described as a perfect storm of adolescent cruelty. Blake provided the physical intimidation and social status that made resistance seem futile. Tyler contributed the technological savvy and genuine enthusiasm for causing pain that kept their campaign fresh and publicly documented. Jessica added the social intelligence and reputation management that ensured their actions would be seen as acceptable by their peers while their victims would be blamed for their own suffering. The bullying campaign they launched against Kira had started small, almost experimentally, as if they were testing the limits of what they could get away with. A shoulder check in the hallway here, delivered with just enough force to send her stumbling, but not enough to be obviously intentional. A snide comment there, spoken just loud enough for her to hear, but quietly enough that they could deny malicious intent if questioned by authority figures. They knocked books from her hands with carefully orchestrated accidents that looked clumsy rather than deliberate. They would trip her on the stairs, always ready with apologies that sounded sincere to adult observers, but carried unmistakable mockery to anyone who understood the subtext. The psychological aspects of their campaign were perhaps even more damaging than the physical harassment. They would whisper cruel jokes about her appearance, her family's restaurant, her accent, which she didn't actually have, but they pretended to hear, just loud enough for her to catch fragments of their conversations. They created social media accounts dedicated to mocking foreign students without ever mentioning her name directly, but making the target obvious to anyone who knew the context. They would exclude her from group projects by claiming they were already full, then loudly discuss their work in front of her as if she didn't exist. The teachers at Jefferson High seemed to operate under a philosophy that if they didn't witness harassment directly and explicitly, it wasn't their problem to address. This willful blindness was partly due to the administrative pressure to maintain order without creating disciplinary documentation that might reflect poorly on the school's statistics. It was also influenced by the uncomfortable reality that dealing with bullying required time, energy, and potential conflict with influential parents that many educators were simply unwilling to take on. Mrs. Rodriguez, Kira's English teacher, had once witnessed Blake accidentally spill water on Kira's carefully completed homework assignment. The liquid had spread across the desk, turning hours of meticulous work into illegible smears of ink and ruined paper. Blake had immediately launched into an elaborate apology, claiming that his elbow had been bumped by another student, expressing concern for Kira's work and offering to help her explain the situation to the teacher. Mrs. Rodriguez had simply sighed, told Kira she could turn in the assignment the next day, and moved on with the lesson as if nothing significant had occurred. This response, or lack thereof, had been typical of the adult reactions Kira encountered. Teachers and administrators seemed to view the systematic harassment as a normal part of the high school experience, something that students needed to navigate on their own, rather than a problem requiring institutional intervention. They would offer platitudes about building character and learning to deal with difficult people, as if being targeted for racial harassment and systematic humiliation were valuable life lessons rather than violations of basic human dignity. The guidance counselor, Mr. Patterson, had been even less helpful when Kira had finally worked up the courage to speak with him about her situation. He had listened to her carefully worded description of the harassment with the kind of professional attention that suggested he was checking boxes rather than actually engaging with her concerns. His advice had been to try to blend in better and avoid situations where conflicts might arise, essentially telling her that being targeted was her own fault and that her relief would come only through making herself invisible. Kira endured it all with the same quiet dignity that had first attracted Blake's negative attention, understanding instinctively that showing weakness would only escalate their campaign, while showing defiance would provide them with justification for more aggressive tactics. She would clean up their messes, gather her scattered papers with methodical precision, and continue with her day as if their actions had no effect on her emotional state. Her classmates, grateful not to be targets themselves and unwilling to risk their own social standing by intervening, would look away or pretend they hadn't seen anything when the harassment occurred in their presence. In the complex ecosystem of high school social dynamics, Kira had become the designated victim, the one whose suffering allowed others to feel safe by comparison. Her victimization served a function in the school's social order, providing an outlet for cruelty that might otherwise be directed at someone with more social connections or family influence. Students who might have been potential allies chose instead to maintain their own security by ensuring that the target remained fixed on someone else. The psychological toll of this sustained harassment was significant. Though Kira worked hard to hide its effects from her family and the few friends she had managed to maintain despite the social pressure to isolate her, she found herself dreading school each morning, lying in bed for precious extra minutes while trying to summon the emotional energy to face another day of systematic humiliation. Her grades, which had always been excellent, began to suffer as her concentration was disrupted by the constant vigilance required to navigate hostile hallways. Sleep became elusive as her mind replayed the day's incidents and worried about tomorrow's potential confrontations. The restaurant work that had once been a pleasant way to connect with her cultural heritage and help her family became another source of stress as she worried that her classmates might show up and witness her working, providing them with additional ammunition for their harassment campaign. Even her previously strong relationship with her parents began to show strain as she struggled to explain her changing mood and declining academic performance without revealing the extent of what she was experiencing at school. The breaking point that would finally force her to abandon her father's advice about choosing the better path came on a Tuesday morning in late October that had started with unusual optimism. Kira had been saving money from her part-time job at her uncle's restaurant for months, setting aside small amounts from her modest paycheck with the discipline that her father had taught her in all aspects of life. Her goal had been to purchase a specific top she had been admiring for weeks, a simple but elegant piece in deep blue that she had seen in a downtown boutique window during one of her rare shopping trips with her mother. The top represented more than just clothing to Kira. It symbolized her desire to fit in, to feel confident and attractive, to have something beautiful that was entirely her own choice rather than a hand-me-down or practical necessity. She had tried it on twice, each time admiring how the color complemented her skin tone and how the cut made her feel feminine and sophisticated. The price had been a significant investment for her, representing nearly 2 months of careful saving, but she had finally accumulated enough money to make the purchase. The night before wearing it to school, she had hung it carefully in her closet, smoothing out any wrinkles and imagining how it might change her day. Perhaps someone would notice and compliment her. Perhaps David Chen, the quiet boy from her AP literature class who had always been kind to her, might see her in a new light. Perhaps she might feel for just one day like she belonged among her more fashionable classmates instead of being the invisible girl in oversized sweaters and worn jeans. She had worn the top to school that Tuesday with a rare sense of anticipation, allowing herself to imagine positive interactions and successful days in a way that had become increasingly difficult as the harassment campaign had intensified. The deep blue fabric felt like confidence against her skin, and she had even spent extra time on her hair that morning, letting it fall more naturally around her face instead of hiding behind it as she had been doing for weeks. The morning classes had gone well, with several teachers commenting positively on her contributions to discussions and her completed assignments. During the break between second and third period, she had caught her reflection in a bathroom mirror and actually smiled at what she saw. The top looked even better than she had imagined, and for a brief moment, she felt like a normal teenage girl getting ready for a normal day rather than a target preparing for survival. It was during the transition between third and fourth period that her optimism was shattered in the most devastating way possible. She was walking past the trophy case near the gymnasium, a route she had chosen specifically because it was usually less crowded than the main hallways, when Blake and his crew spotted her. The trophy case itself was a monument to Jefferson High's athletic achievements, filled with gleaming awards that Blake's father had helped fund through his generous donations to the sports programs. "Well, well," Blake said as he approached with Tyler and Jessica flanking him, his voice carrying that particular tone that made Kira's stomach drop with recognition and dread. "Look what the delivery girl is wearing today. Did you steal that from the lost and found, or did Mommy and Daddy finally make enough money at their little restaurant to buy you something decent?" Tyler immediately pulled out his smartphone, as he always did when Blake was about to perform one of his public humiliations. The device had become an extension of his personality, constantly ready to capture moments of suffering that could be edited, posted and shared for the entertainment of their social media followers. His cruel smile widened as he positioned himself for the best camera angle, already anticipating the viral potential of whatever was about to unfold. "Maybe her parents bought it with tip money from their restaurant," Tyler added with his characteristic giggle, the sound like fingernails on a chalkboard to anyone with basic human empathy. "You know how they are with money. Probably saved every penny for months just to afford one decent piece of clothing for their little princess." Kira tried to walk past them, her heart racing as she recognized the familiar setup that had preceded so many previous incidents of public humiliation. She knew from experience that engaging with them would only make things worse, but she also knew that trying to avoid them rarely worked when they had decided to make her their entertainment for the day. Her hands instinctively moved to protect her new top, a gesture that unfortunately drew their attention to exactly what she was trying to shield. "I'm just trying to get to class," Kira said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear and anger building inside her chest like a pressure cooker approaching its breaking point. She kept her eyes fixed on the hallway ahead, trying to project the kind of calm determination that might convince them to find an easier target. "Did you hear that?" Jessica chimed in with her characteristic false sweetness, the tone she had perfected for delivering cruelty disguised as concern. "She thinks she's too good to talk to us now. Maybe that new shirt is giving her ideas about her place in this school. Maybe she thinks buying one expensive piece of clothing makes her equal to people who actually belong here." What happened next would replay in Kira's memory for years to come, each detail preserved with the clarity that extreme trauma can sometimes provide. Blake reached out with his large, strong hand and grabbed the delicate fabric of her new top, his fingers twisting in the material with deliberate malice. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the moment when he decided that simple verbal harassment wasn't enough, that this situation required a more dramatic demonstration of his power over her. "Let's see how good this really is," Blake said, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of other students in the hallway. His grip tightened on the fabric, and Kira could feel the threads beginning to strain under the pressure. She opened her mouth to protest, to ask him to stop, to appeal to whatever basic human decency might exist beneath his cruel exterior. Then he pulled. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet space. Kira's beautiful new top, the symbol of her hopes for acceptance and confidence, ripped down the front in a jagged line that exposed her underneath clothing to the growing crowd of onlookers. She scrambled to pull her cardigan closed, her face burning with a combination of shame, anger, and disbelief that someone could be so deliberately cruel. The small crowd of students who had gathered to watch the confrontation burst into laughter, the sound hitting Kira like physical blows as she stood there trying to cover herself and salvage some shred of dignity from the situation. Tyler's phone captured every moment of her humiliation with high-definition clarity. The footage that would later be edited into a highlight reel of her suffering and shared across multiple social media platforms. But it was what Blake said next that truly broke something fundamental inside her, crossing a line that she hadn't even realized existed until it was obliterated. "Maybe stick to clothes from your own country next time," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear clearly. The racist undertone that had always lurked beneath his harassment was now explicit and undeniable, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that made it clear he felt no shame about his prejudice. "This American stuff is too good for you anyway. You should know your place by now." The words hit Kira like a physical assault, not just because of their obvious racism, but because of what they represented about her place in a country her parents had sacrificed everything to call home. Her father had competed for Korea in international tournaments, representing his homeland with pride and honor. Her mother had given up her career as a teacher to help build their family business in America. They had worked 18-hour days, learned a new language, navigated complex immigration processes, and endured their own share of discrimination to build a life where their children could have opportunities they had never enjoyed. Kira bent down to pick up the torn pieces of her top, her hands shaking with a combination of rage and humiliation that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The beautiful blue fabric that had made her feel confident just moments before was now reduced to scraps of material that she clutched against her chest like protective armor. As she straightened up, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened, she caught sight of David Chen watching from across the hallway. David was in her AP literature class, a quiet guy with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of gentle demeanor that had always made her feel safe in his presence. He was one of the few people at Jefferson High who treated her like a human being rather than an inconvenience or a target, always willing to share notes when she missed class or include her in study groups when other students made excuses to exclude her. She had harbored a secret crush on him for months, admiring his thoughtful contributions to class discussions and his obvious kindness toward everyone, regardless of their social status. The look of sympathy and anger in David's eyes as he witnessed her humiliation was somehow worse than all the laughter from the other students combined. She could see his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight with the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was barely restraining himself from intervening. His obvious concern for her welfare and his equally obvious helplessness in the face of the social dynamics that protected Blake from consequences made her feel even more exposed and vulnerable. He started to move toward her, clearly wanting to help despite the potential social cost to his own reputation, but Blake's crew was already dispersing, their entertainment concluded, and their dominance re-established. The hallway was returning to its normal level of noise and activity as students moved toward their next classes, most of them already losing interest in the drama now that it was over. Kira clutched her cardigan tighter around her ruined top and ran for the nearest bathroom, David's concerned voice calling her name echoing behind her as she fled from the scene of her latest humiliation. The bathroom became her refuge, a place where she could finally allow the tears she had been holding back to fall freely while she assessed the damage to both her clothing and her dignity. Standing in front of the mirror in the empty bathroom, Kira looked at her reflection and barely recognized the person staring back at her. The confident girl who had admired herself that morning was gone, replaced by someone who looked defeated and broken. Her carefully styled hair was disheveled, her face was blotchy from trying not to cry, and her beautiful new top was completely ruined. Unwearable, even if it could be repaired, but more than the physical damage was the emotional toll of realizing that her strategy of quiet dignity and patient endurance was not working. If anything, her refusal to fight back seemed to be encouraging Blake and his crew to escalate their campaign of harassment. They had crossed lines she didn't even know existed, moving from general cruelty into explicit racism and destruction of her personal property. That afternoon, Kira sat in her car in the school parking lot, staring at the torn remnants of her top and trying to process what had happened. The parking lot was nearly empty, most students having rushed off to after-school activities or part-time jobs, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her ruined clothing. Her father's words came back to her with painful clarity. True strength is having the power to destroy your enemies, but choosing a better path. But what if the better path wasn't working? What if quiet dignity was just another word for cowardice? What if choosing not to fight was actually enabling more violence rather than preventing it? She drove home in a state of emotional numbness, her mind cycling through the day's events and trying to find some alternative interpretation that would make sense of the senseless cruelty she had experienced. When she arrived at the family house, a modest two-story structure that her parents had managed to purchase after years of saving and sacrifice, she went straight to the garage without stopping to greet her family or explain her obvious distress. The garage had been converted into a training space that served as both a practical dojang and a spiritual sanctuary for the Voss family. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling beams, their leather surfaces worn smooth by years of dedicated practice. Wooden training dummies stood in perfect alignment, each one representing hundreds of hours of repetitive drills designed to build the kind of muscle memory that could react faster than conscious thought. Mirrors covered one entire wall, allowing practitioners to observe and correct their form with ruthless precision. Kira changed into her training clothes, the familiar white dobak feeling like armor as she tied the belt her father had earned for her through years of patient instruction. She approached the heavy bag that had absorbed her frustrations and ambitions for nearly a decade, its worn surface marked with the impressions of countless training sessions that had built both her physical skills and mental discipline. She began to work with the intensity that surprised even her fists and feet finding their rhythm against the leather with increasing power and precision. Each strike represented something specific. Blake's smug face when he grabbed her top, Tyler's cruel laughter as he recorded her humiliation, Jessica's false sweetness as she delivered psychological wounds designed to cause maximum damage. The bag swayed under her assault, the sound of her strikes echoing through the garage like thunderclaps. Her father found her there an hour later, sweat streaming down her face as she continued to pound out her frustration and anger on the unresisting leather. Jin Voss watched his daughter with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades studying martial arts, noting the precision of her techniques, the power behind her strikes, and the emotional intensity that was driving her performance to levels he hadn't seen since her early competitive days. "Something happened at school," he said quietly, the statement carrying the weight of paternal understanding rather than interrogation. He could read the signs in her body language, in the way she was attacking the bag with personal fury rather than technical practice. Kira continued striking for several more combinations before finally stopping, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath and organize her thoughts enough to explain the day's events. "They destroyed my new top," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush that carried all the pain and anger she had been suppressing. Blake Morrison and his friends. They ripped it apart in front of everyone, made racist comments, recorded it for social media. "I tried to follow your advice about choosing the better path, but it's not working. They're getting worse, not better." Jin nodded slowly, his weathered face showing the kind of thoughtful consideration that had made him a successful competitor and teacher. "The better path is not always the passive path," he said after a long moment of silence. "Sometimes, the better path requires us to stand up for what is right, even when standing up is difficult or dangerous. The question is not whether you should fight, but when fighting becomes necessary and how it should be conducted." Over the next few days, Kira's routine changed dramatically as she wrestled with the implications of her father's words and her own growing realization that her current strategy was failing to protect her from escalating harassment. She still attended classes, still completed her homework with the academic excellence that had always been her trademark, still worked at the family restaurant during her scheduled shifts. But she also spent hours in the garage, pushing her body to remember skills that had grown rusty from disuse, and developing new techniques that might be necessary if the situation continued to deteriorate. Her father noticed the change in her training regimen, but said nothing directly, simply nodding approvingly when he saw her practicing forms in the backyard during the early morning hours before school. He began leaving training manuals and instructional videos in places where she would find them, subtle guidance that helped her refine techniques and develop strategies without making her feel like she was being pushed toward violence. The bullying campaign against her continued during this period, but something fundamental had shifted in Kira's demeanor that both her tormentors and her classmates began to notice. Where before she had seemed defeated and vulnerable, now she seemed to be waiting for something. Her posture was straighter, her movements more purposeful, her responses to harassment more measured and controlled rather than purely defensive. Blake and his crew noticed the change, but misinterpreted it as fear rather than preparation. They assumed that their escalating tactics had finally broken her spirit completely, and that her new behavior represented complete submission to their dominance. This misunderstanding led them to become even more bold and aggressive, confident that they could push her as far as they wanted without consequences. Tyler began following her with his phone more frequently, hoping to capture footage of a complete breakdown that would provide them with their most viral content yet. Jessica increased the sophistication of her psychological warfare, spreading rumors about Kira's family and their restaurant that were designed to isolate her from any potential sources of support. Blake himself began to view their harassment campaign as a personal crusade, something that validated his sense of superiority and his right to determine who belonged at Jefferson High and who should be driven away. David Chen had also noticed the change in Kira's behavior, but his interpretation was very different from that of her tormentors. As someone who genuinely cared about her welfare and had been watching the harassment campaign with growing concern, he recognized that she was reaching some kind of decision point. He began making more efforts to be nearby when Blake's crew was likely to target her, not obviously following her, but ensuring that he was in positions where he could intervene if necessary. It was David who inadvertently triggered the final confrontation that would resolve the situation one way or another. On a Friday afternoon, after weeks of internal debate and careful observation of Kira's changing demeanor, he had finally worked up the courage to approach her at her locker when the hallway was relatively quiet and they could have a private conversation. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle but carrying an undertone of nervousness that revealed how much this moment meant to him. His wire-rimmed glasses had slipped slightly down his nose, and he pushed them back up in a gesture that Kira found endearingly awkward. "I was wondering if you'd like to go to the movies this weekend. There's this new action film playing at the theater downtown that's supposed to be really good." Kira felt her heart skip as she processed what David was saying. Despite everything that had happened, despite the constant harassment and her growing preparation for potential violence, David was asking her out on a date. The normalcy of the request, the assumption that she was someone worth spending time with, the simple human kindness of someone wanting her company hit her with unexpected emotional force. For a moment, all the stress and humiliation of the past few weeks faded into background noise as she focused on the gentle, intelligent boy who had consistently treated her with respect and kindness when so many others had chosen cruelty or indifference. "I'd like that," she said, allowing herself a genuine smile that felt foreign after weeks of careful emotional control. "I'd really like that." Great," David said, his own smile lighting up his face with obvious relief and happiness. He had clearly been nervous about asking, uncertain whether she would be interested or if the social dynamics of high school would make dating him too complicated or dangerous for her. "I'll pick you up at 7 on Saturday." "Perfect," Kira replied, and for the first time in weeks, she felt genuinely happy about something that had nothing to do with martial arts, revenge, or self-defense. The prospect of a normal teenage date, of sitting in a dark theater watching an action movie with someone who liked her for who she was, rather than as a target for cruelty, felt like a glimpse of the life she should have been living all along. Unfortunately, Jessica Palmer had been eavesdropping from around the corner, her predatory instincts having led her to follow David when she noticed him approaching Kira's locker. Jessica possessed a particular talent for being in the right place at the right time to gather intelligence that could be weaponized against her targets. And this conversation represented exactly the kind of information she could use to cause maximum damage. By Monday morning, the entire school knew about Kira and David's movie date, but the story had been twisted through Jessica's sophisticated rumor mill into something barely recognizable. According to the version that spread through the hallways like wildfire, Kira had thrown herself at David desperately, practically begging him for a date because she was so desperate for any male attention she could get. The narrative painted her as pathetic and predatory, someone who couldn't attract interest through normal means and had resorted to manipulation and ethnic guilt to force an unwilling boy into spending time with her. The speed and efficiency with which the rumor spread was a testament to Jessica's understanding of the school's social dynamics and communication networks. She knew exactly which students were most likely to repeat gossip, which friend groups would find the story particularly entertaining, and how to phrase the information to make it seem like she was sharing it reluctantly rather than maliciously. Blake Morrison saw an opportunity in this development that was too perfect to ignore. If he could engineer a public humiliation of Kira in front of David, he could accomplish multiple goals simultaneously, reassert his dominance over her, demonstrate his power to the school community, and potentially damage David's reputation as well for the crime of treating Kira like a human being worth dating. Blake had never particularly liked David anyway, viewing him as too quiet, too studious, and too decent for Blake's taste. David represented everything that Blake found threatening about academic achievement and moral integrity. He was proof that someone could earn respect and admiration through kindness and intelligence rather than aggression and intimidation, which challenged the fundamental premises upon which Blake had built his entire social identity. The final confrontation came during lunch period on the Tuesday following David's invitation, in the most public possible setting where maximum humiliation could be achieved and maximum witnesses could be gathered. The cafeteria was packed with its usual crowd of hundreds of teenagers, all of them potential audience members for whatever drama Blake was planning to create. Kira was sitting with David at a table near the windows, actually laughing at something he had said about their upcoming chemistry exam. For the first time in weeks, she looked relaxed and genuinely happy, her guard down as she enjoyed the simple pleasure of normal teenage conversation with someone who appreciated her intelligence and sense of humor. The sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the natural beauty that her stress and defensive posturing had been hiding, and she looked like what she actually was. A 17-year-old girl enjoying lunch with a boy she liked. Blake's approach was calculated for maximum theatrical impact. He stood up from his usual central table and began walking toward them with Tyler and Jessica flanking him like an honor guard, their movement deliberate enough to attract attention from surrounding tables. Conversations began to quiet as students sensed that something significant was about to happen and turned their attention toward the unfolding drama. Well, well, Blake announced as he reached their table, his voice projected loud enough to carry across the now quieting cafeteria. If it isn't the happy couple. How was your little date, David? Did she make you pay for everything? Or does she actually have money from that family restaurant where she works as a delivery girl? David immediately stood up, his jaw tight with controlled anger and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Despite his generally peaceful nature, he possessed his own sense of honor and protective instincts that were being triggered by Blake's obvious aggression towards someone he cared about. "Leave us alone, Blake," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a warning that anyone with sense would have heeded. "Oh, the boyfriend's going to defend her honor," Tyler laughed as he pulled out his smartphone to begin recording what promised to be their most entertaining content yet. His cruel smile widened as he positioned himself for the best camera angle, already anticipating the viral potential of whatever was about to unfold. "This should be good. Let's see if the quiet guy can actually fight or if he's as pathetic as his girlfriend." Blake turned his full attention to Kira, who had gone very still in her seat as she recognized the setup that had preceded so many previous incidents of public humiliation. But this time was different because David was involved, because the harassment was taking place in front of someone whose opinion mattered to her, and because she had spent the intervening weeks preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said the other day about not being able to afford nice clothes," Blake continued, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that had become his signature. "Maybe David can buy you a new top to replace the one I accidentally tore. Although I'm not sure he should waste his money on someone who clearly doesn't understand her place in this school." "That's enough," David said more firmly, stepping between Blake and Kira in a gesture that was both protective and challenging. Despite being smaller and less physically imposing than Blake, he was prepared to fight if necessary to defend her dignity and his own principles about how people should be treated. "Is it enough?" Blake responded, his voice rising as he sensed that the confrontation was reaching its climax. He pushed David aside with casual strength, demonstrating the physical dominance that had always been his primary tool for maintaining control over situations and people. "Because I think your girlfriend needs to learn her place in this school once and for all, and her place is at the bottom where foreign trash belongs." Before Kira could react or David could intervene, Blake grabbed her lunch tray with both hands and dumped the entire contents over her head in a deliberate act of humiliation designed to destroy any remaining dignity she might have retained. Cold soup cascaded down her face and into her hair, while sandwich pieces and fruit scattered across her lap and the floor around her chair. The cafeteria erupted in a mixture of laughter, gasps, and shocked silence as students processed what they were witnessing. Tyler's phone captured every moment of the assault with high-definition clarity, his cackling laugh adding a soundtrack of cruelty to the visual record of Kira's humiliation. Jessica stood behind them with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile, pleased with how perfectly their plan was executing and already planning how she would spin the narrative to ensure that Kira would be blamed for somehow provoking the attack. The food dripped from Kira's hair and face as she sat there processing what had just happened, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated harassment and public humiliation. This wasn't just another incident in their ongoing campaign. This was a deliberate escalation designed to destroy her completely in front of the person whose respect and affection she most valued. But Blake wasn't finished with his performance. As Kira sat there covered in food and struggling to maintain some shred of dignity, he leaned down close enough that both she and David could hear his next words clearly. "You could do so much better than this foreign trash," he said to David, his voice carrying loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "What would your parents think if they knew you were slumming it with someone like her, someone whose family probably doesn't even belong in this country?" That was the moment when something fundamental snapped inside Kira Voss. Not the public humiliation, which she had endured before. Not the ruined clothes or the wasted food, which were merely material damages. Not even the racist comments, which were unfortunately familiar territory. It was the way Blake was trying to poison her relationship with David, attempting to destroy the one source of genuine happiness and human connection she had found in the nightmare that Jefferson High had become. All of her father's lessons about choosing the better path, about having the power to destroy but choosing restraint, about the true nature of strength and discipline, crystallized in that moment into a single clear understanding. Sometimes the better path required standing up to bullies who would never stop escalating their cruelty until they were forced to stop. Kira stood up slowly, soup still dripping from her hair and sandwich pieces falling from her shoulders. Her movements were controlled and deliberate, with the kind of fluid grace that years of martial arts training had ingrained in her muscle memory. The laughter in the cafeteria began to die down as students sensed something different in her posture, something that suggested the familiar pattern of victim and aggressor was about to change in ways they hadn't expected. "You know what, Blake?" Kira said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room, with a confidence and authority that no one at Jefferson High had ever heard from her before. Every word was precisely articulated, delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that made even students at distant tables stop their conversations to listen. "I'm done." Blake smiled with the same arrogant confidence that had carried him through countless previous victories over weaker opponents, thinking that he had finally broken her completely and that this was the moment of her total surrender. "Done with what?" he asked mockingly. "Pretending you belong here? Pretending you're good enough for someone like David? Finally ready to transfer to some other school where they appreciate foreign students?" "Done with you," Kira replied, and the way she said it carried such finality and quiet menace that Blake's smile began to falter as he realized that something in the fundamental dynamic between them had shifted in ways he didn't understand. "What did you just say to me?" Blake demanded, his voice rising as he felt his control over the situation beginning to slip. His face was flushing red with a combination of anger and something that might have been the first stirrings of actual concern about how this confrontation might end. "I said I'm done with you," Kira repeated, wiping soup from her face with deliberate calm while maintaining eye contact that contained none of the fear or submission he had grown accustomed to seeing. "I'm done with your pathetic need to hurt people weaker than you to feel important. I'm done with your racist comments that reveal more about your insecurity than my heritage. And I'm done pretending that you're anything more than a sad, insecure boy who's going to peak in high school and spend the rest of his life telling stories about when he used to matter." The cafeteria had gone completely silent now, hundreds of students holding their breath as they witnessed something unprecedented, someone standing up to Blake Morrison in a direct confrontation that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Even the lunch staff had stopped their work to watch the drama unfolding at the table near the windows. Blake's face had gone from red to purple as he processed the magnitude of the insult and public challenge to his authority. His hands clenched into fists as he struggled with the realization that his usual intimidation tactics weren't working and that he would need to escalate to physical violence to reassert his dominance. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he shouted, loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear clearly. "You think you're tough now, foreign girl?" "I don't think I'm tough," Kira said, her voice remaining steady and controlled, even as she prepared for the physical confrontation that was now inevitable. Her father's training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to read her opponent's intentions, and to wait for the right moment to act decisively. "I know I am," Blake lunged forward with a wild right-hand punch aimed at Kira's face, putting all of his considerable strength behind a blow that was designed to end the fight immediately and re-establish his reputation as someone who couldn't be challenged without severe consequences. What happened next would be talked about at Jefferson High for years to come, a story that would grow in the telling but would never need exaggeration to remain impressive. Kira moved like water flowing around a stone, her years of training allowing her to see the punch coming long before it arrived and to respond with movements that seemed effortless but were actually the result of thousands of hours of disciplined practice. Her left hand intercepted Blake's wrist with precise timing, redirecting his momentum and using his own forward motion against him. Simultaneously, her right elbow drove upward into his solar plexus with surgical accuracy, striking the nerve center that would paralyze his diaphragm and leave him gasping for air. The impact drove all the breath from Blake's lungs in a single explosive wheeze, leaving him doubled over and struggling to remember how breathing worked. His face went from purple to gray as his body processed the shock of being hit by someone who actually knew how to fight. Someone who could target vulnerable points with the kind of precision that turned smaller size into a significant advantage. But Kira wasn't finished with her demonstration. As Blake stumbled backward, still gasping and trying to process what had just happened to him, she followed up with a perfectly executed knee strike to his midsection. The technique her father had drilled into her thousands of times connected with devastating effectiveness, lifting Blake slightly off his feet and sending him staggering across the cafeteria floor. The final element of her combination was a textbook roundhouse kick that caught Blake in the ribs just as he was trying to regain his balance. The sound of the impact echoed across the silent cafeteria like a gunshot, and Blake went sprawling across the floor in an undignified heap, sliding several feet before coming to rest against someone else's table. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds from beginning to end, but it represented a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had governed Jefferson High's social order for years. Blake Morrison, the untouchable king of the school's hierarchy, was lying on the cafeteria floor, gasping for breath, while a girl half his size stood over him, looking completely composed and ready to continue if necessary. Tyler had dropped his smartphone in shock, his mouth hanging open as he processed the impossible sight of his invincible leader being systematically dismantled by someone they had all assumed was helpless. The phone skittered across the floor, its screen cracked from the impact, the recording function still running and capturing the aftermath of Blake's humiliation. Around the cafeteria, students were on their feet, some cheering, others simply staring in amazement at what they had just witnessed. The sound of applause began to ripple through the room, not the cruel laughter that had followed Kira's previous humiliations, but genuine admiration for someone who had finally stood up to a bully and emerged victorious. Jessica had stumbled backward, her face pale with shock as she realized that their carefully orchestrated plan had backfired completely. Instead of destroying Kira's reputation and social standing, they had created a legend that would follow them for the rest of their time at Jefferson High. Instead of reasserting Blake's dominance, they had exposed his vulnerability in the most public way possible. Blake struggled to his feet, still gasping and clutching his ribs. But his pride wouldn't let him accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that he had been outclassed. His face was a mask of rage and humiliation, as he realized that his reputation as the school's untouchable alpha had been destroyed in front of hundreds of witnesses. He swung wildly at Kira again, but his movements were clumsy and desperate rather than strategic. Kira sidestepped his second attack with even greater ease than the first, using his momentum against him to execute a perfect hip throw that sent him flying over her shoulder to impact the floor with enough force to knock the remaining wind from his lungs. The technique was so flawlessly executed that it looked almost choreographed, as if she were demonstrating proper form for a martial arts class rather than defending herself in a real fight. Tyler, seeing his leader getting systematically destroyed and realizing that their social order was collapsing around them, decided to intervene in the hope of salvaging something from the disaster. He rushed at Kira from behind while she was still focused on Blake, thinking that he could catch her off guard and turn the tide of the confrontation. But Kira had been trained to fight multiple opponents, a skill that her father had insisted upon because real-world confrontations rarely involved the courtesy of one-on-one combat. She sensed Tyler's approach through peripheral vision and auditory cues, spinning to face him while simultaneously catching his outstretched arm and twisting it behind his back in a control hold that brought him to his knees immediately. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, causing Tyler to cry out as Kira applied just enough pressure to demonstrate her complete control over the situation without causing permanent damage. His cruel laughter was replaced by tears of pain and humiliation as he found himself completely helpless in the grip of someone he had spent weeks tormenting. "Stay down," Kira told him, her voice cold as winter ice but carrying absolute authority that made it clear she was prepared to escalate her response if he continued to resist. Tyler nodded frantically through his tears, any thought of further aggression abandoned in favor of immediate compliance with her instructions. Blake had managed to get to his feet again, but he was moving more cautiously now. The easy confidence that had defined his interactions with other students, replaced by the dawning realization that he had severely underestimated his opponent. The casual cruelty that had been his trademark was gone, replaced by something approaching desperation as he realized that his entire social identity was crumbling in real time. He swung at her one more time, but the punch was wild and unfocused, thrown from too far away with poor balance and technique. Kira ducked under his swing easily and drove her fist into his ribs with surgical precision, targeting the floating ribs that would cause maximum pain with minimal permanent damage. The crack of cartilage was audible across the cafeteria, and Blake screamed as he stumbled backward, clutching his injured side. Blake was finished as the effective fighter, his body no longer responding to his commands as pain and exhaustion overwhelmed his system, but his pride and social desperation wouldn't allow him to surrender gracefully. He fumbled for his smartphone with shaking hands, as if calling for help could somehow restore his lost dignity and erase the evidence of his complete defeat. Kira was already moving before he could complete whatever desperate plan he was attempting. She launched herself forward in a perfect flying kick, her right foot connecting with his chest with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him crashing into the wall behind him. The technique was executed with textbook precision, demonstrating years of training and natural ability that none of her classmates had suspected she possessed. Blake slid down the wall and stayed there, gasping and defeated, his expensive clothes disheveled and his perfectly styled hair hanging in sweaty strands around his bruised face. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Kira stood over him with her fist raised for what could have been a finishing blow that would have completed his humiliation and potentially caused serious injury. The entire cafeteria held its breath, waiting to see if she would cross the line from legitimate self-defense to aggressive retaliation. This was the moment that would define not just the outcome of the fight, but the kind of person Kira would choose to become. Her father's lessons about true strength echoed in her memory, reminding her that having the power to destroy an enemy was meaningless unless it was coupled with the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary and when mercy was the stronger choice. Slowly, deliberately, Kira lowered her fist and stepped back from Blake's defeated form. "Stay away from me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria with the kind of authority that made it clear this was not a request or a negotiation. "Stay away from David. Stay away from anyone who can't defend themselves. Because if you don't, I promise you that what just happened was nothing more than a warm-up for what I'm capable of doing." Blake nodded weakly, unable to speak through his gasps for air and the pain radiating from his injured ribs. The agreement was extracted not through fear of further physical punishment, but through the complete destruction of his illusion of invincibility and the recognition that he had encountered someone whose skill and determination far exceeded his own capacity for violence. Around the cafeteria, students were applauding with genuine enthusiasm. But this was not the cruel entertainment they had derived from previous incidents of harassment and humiliation. This was respect, admiration for someone who had stood up to systematic cruelty and emerged victorious through skill, courage, and the kind of moral authority that came from being clearly in the right. David appeared at Kira's side, his face displaying a mixture of awe, concern, and deep admiration for what he had just witnessed. He had been prepared to fight Blake himself despite the obvious physical disadvantage, but seeing Kira handle the situation with such decisive effectiveness had revealed capabilities he had never suspected she possessed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system from the confrontation they had both just survived. "I'm fine," Kira said, and for the first time in weeks, the words carried complete truth rather than defensive bravado. She looked around the cafeteria at the faces of her classmates, seeing respect and admiration where there had previously been indifference or cruel entertainment. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm exactly where I need to be." The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and decisive, with consequences that rippled through Jefferson High's social structure in ways that would be felt for years to come. Principal Martinez arrived on the scene within minutes, having been summoned by cafeteria staff who recognized that something unprecedented had occurred that required immediate administrative attention. The dozens of witnesses and Tyler's own accidentally recorded footage made it impossible to dispute what had actually happened, providing clear evidence of who had been the aggressor and who had acted in self-defense. The video showed Blake initiating physical violence against someone who had been sitting peacefully at lunch, documenting his pattern of harassment and escalation that had led to the confrontation. Blake received a 2-week suspension and was immediately removed from the football team, his athletic scholarship prospects severely damaged by the disciplinary action and the viral footage of his defeat. The school administration, faced with undeniable evidence of his behavior and pressure from parents who had seen the video, was forced to take action that had been avoided for years through his family's influence and donations. Tyler and Jessica received significant disciplinary consequences as well, including detention, community service, and exclusion from school events for the remainder of the semester. More importantly, their social standing was irreparably damaged by their association with Blake's humiliation and their own cowardly behavior during the confrontation. Kira received a single day of in-school suspension, a token punishment that Principal Martinez had privately acknowledged was necessary to maintain the fiction that the school district couldn't officially condone violence, regardless of how justified it might have been. He had told her confidentially that while the school's policies required some disciplinary response to any physical altercation, he understood that she had been defending herself against a documented pattern of harassment and racism that should never have been allowed to escalate to the point of violence. The change in Jefferson High's social dynamics was immediate and profound, representing a fundamental shift in power structures that had seemed immutable just days before. Students who had previously ignored Kira's suffering or actively participated in her isolation now approached her with genuine apologies and expressions of respect for her courage in standing up to systematic bullying. The hallways that had once felt like hostile territory became simply pathways to class. navigated without the constant vigilance and defensive positioning that had characterized her daily routine for weeks. Teachers who had previously looked the other way when harassment occurred now nodded approvingly when they encountered her, some even mentioning privately that they were glad someone had finally stood up to the kind of behavior they had felt powerless to address through official channels. Blake returned to school 2 weeks later, his swagger completely gone and his social standing irreparably damaged. He walked with his head down, his broken ribs still healing and serving as a constant reminder of his defeat and humiliation. The expensive clothes and perfect hairstyle that had once announced his status now seemed like costume pieces from a play that no one wanted to watch anymore. He never bothered Kira again, and when their paths crossed in the hallway, he would actually step aside to let her pass, his eyes fixed on the floor to avoid the possibility of confrontation with someone whose capabilities he now understood and respected. The casual racism and cruel comments that had been his trademark were replaced by silence and avoidance, recognition that his previous behavior had consequences he was no longer willing to risk. Tyler and Jessica suffered similar social exile, their reputations destroyed by their association with Blake's campaign of harassment and their cowardly behavior when confronted with real resistance. Tyler's smartphone recordings, which had once been sources of cruel entertainment, were now viewed as evidence of his participation in systematic bullying that the school community no longer found acceptable or entertaining. On the Friday following the cafeteria confrontation, Kira sat in her car in the school parking lot, but this time she wasn't hiding from harassment or processing humiliation. She was waiting for David, who had asked her to attend the school's winter formal with him, a request that represented not just romantic interest, but social acceptance and integration into the normal experiences that every teenager deserved to enjoy. As she watched students stream out of the building toward weekend activities and part-time jobs, she reflected on the fundamental changes that had occurred in her life and her understanding of strength, courage, and moral authority. She had learned that sometimes the better path wasn't about avoiding conflict at all costs, but about recognizing when standing up for what was right required the willingness to confront those who would use violence and intimidation to maintain unjust power structures. She had discovered that her father's lessons about strength and discipline hadn't been about weakness or passive acceptance of mistreatment, but about developing the capability to respond effectively to aggression, while maintaining the moral authority that came from using force only when all other options had been exhausted, and only to the extent necessary to protect herself and others who couldn't protect themselves. Most importantly, she had learned that respect couldn't be demanded, purchased, or inherited, but had to be earned through actions that demonstrated character, courage, and the willingness to stand up for principles, even when doing so involved personal risk and sacrifice. The quiet dignity she had maintained during weeks of harassment had been valuable, but it had gained true power only when coupled with the demonstrated ability and willingness to defend it against those who mistook restraint for weakness. David appeared at her car window with a smile that was both bright and genuine, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the afternoon sunlight as he approached with the kind of confident happiness that came from being with someone he genuinely admired and respected. The events of the previous week had only deepened his appreciation for her character and strength, revealing qualities he had suspected but never fully understood until he witnessed them in action. "Ready to go?" he asked, opening the passenger door with the courtesy and respect that had always characterized his treatment of her, but now carried an additional dimension of admiration for what she had accomplished and who she had proven herself to be. "Ready?" Kira replied, and as they drove away from Jefferson High toward whatever weekend adventure awaited them, she felt truly free for the first time in months. The weight of constant vigilance and defensive positioning had been lifted from her shoulders, replaced by the confidence that came from knowing she possessed both the capability and the moral authority to protect herself and others from the kind of systematic cruelty that had once seemed insurmountable. She had found her strength not in violence itself, but in the courage to stand up for herself and others when all other options had been exhausted, and when standing up was the only way to prevent further escalation of injustice. The quiet girl, who had once been viewed as an easy target, had transformed herself into someone who would never be a victim again, not through aggression or cruelty, but through the development of genuine strength, coupled with the wisdom to use it only when necessary, and only to the extent required to protect the innocent and maintain justice. The story of Kira Voss and her confrontation with Blake Morrison would become legend at Jefferson High, but more importantly, it would serve as an enduring reminder that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others for personal gratification, but from the courage and capability to protect yourself and those you care about when all other options have been exhausted, and when standing up is the only way to prevent further injustice from occurring. In the months that followed, Jefferson High became a different place, with a social culture that was more accepting of differences and less tolerant of systematic harassment and discrimination. Other students who had been targets of bullying found their courage inspired by Kira's example, standing up for themselves and others in ways that created a more positive environment for everyone who had previously felt powerless against the cruelty of those who mistook aggression for strength. Kira's transformation from victim to victor had not been achieved through revenge or the desire to inflict suffering, but through the development of genuine capability combined with the moral authority that came from using that capability only in defense of justice and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. Her father's lessons about true strength had been validated not through passive acceptance of mistreatment, but through the wisdom to know when action was required and the courage to take that action when the moment of truth arrived. The garage where she trained continued to be a place of discipline and preparation, but it was no longer a refuge from injustice so much as a laboratory for developing the kind of strength that could create justice where none had existed before. The heavy bags and training equipment remained the same, but their purpose had evolved from preparing for potential conflict to maintaining the capability that ensured conflict would be unnecessary except in the most extreme circumstances. David and Kira's relationship continued to develop in the healthy environment that her actions had helped create, free from the harassment and social pressure that had once threatened to poison anything good that might have grown between them. Their winter formal date became the first of many normal teenage experiences that she had previously been denied by the systematic cruelty of those who had mistaken her restraint for weakness and her dignity for submission. The lessons learned during those difficult weeks at Jefferson High would serve Kira well throughout her life, providing her with both the practical skills and the moral framework necessary to navigate a world that sometimes required strength to defend justice and protect those who could not protect themselves. She had discovered that true strength was indeed about having the power to destroy enemies while choosing a better path, but that sometimes the better path required demonstrating that power in order to ensure that destruction would never become necessary.